You are standing in an American dealership, staring through the windshield of a new car with a sticker a little over $51,000. That number matters because in March 2026, the average new vehicle sold in the United States cost about $51,456. Now imagine the salesman slides 5 sets of keys across the desk. Not 5 used cars, 5 new electric cars. That sounds ridiculous until you look at China. A Wuling Hongguang Mini EV has been selling there for roughly $6,500. Chang'an's tiny Lumen sits in the same neighborhood, and in 2026, Geely launched an updated Xingyuan electric hatchback with a promotional starting price around $9,100. A real 4-door EV, touchscreen, fast charging, up to 480 kilometers of claimed TLTC range in the higher battery version. For less than $10,000. You cannot walk into an American dealership and buy that car for $9,100. Tariffs, regulation, safety certification, shipping, distribution, and local taxes would change the number dramatically. But that is not the important part. The important part is that someone has figured out how to build an electric car at a price where many Western automakers struggle to build anything at all. And that creates a problem much bigger than cheap Chinese cars. Because the car business is not really a contest over who can make the coolest EV. It is a contest over who can make one cheaply enough to survive a price war. For most of the last century, Western automakers learned to make money from scale, brand, financing, and increasingly expensive vehicles. Walk through an American parking lot and you can see the strategy. Bigger trucks, bigger SUVs, more screens, more trim packages, more options. A customer who once bought a compact sedan for $20,000 can now be pushed toward a crossover at $35,000, $40,000, even $50,000. That works beautifully when buyers keep moving upward. It becomes dangerous when a competitor moves the entire cost curve downward. The strange thing about China's cheap EVs is that they are not cheap because Chinese engineers discovered one magic component. They are cheap because an entire industrial system has been rebuilt around the electric car. And the battery is the best place to see it. In an EV, the battery is one of the most expensive parts of the vehicle. So if your battery costs significantly more than your competitors, before the car even reaches the assembly line, you start the race several meters behind. According to the International Energy Agency, battery electric cars can be manufactured in China at direct costs more than 30% lower than in advanced economies. Battery prices are a huge part of that gap. In 2025, battery packs in China were around 30% cheaper than in North America and 35% cheaper than in Europe. That is not a rounding error. That is the difference between designing an affordable EV and desperately trying to remove another $1,000 from the dashboard. China got there through scale, aggressive competition, automation, supply chain concentration, and a chemistry Western car makers were initially less enthusiastic about: lithium iron phosphate, or LFP. LFP batteries generally sacrifice some energy density compared with nickel-rich chemistries. But they are cheaper. They avoid nickel and cobalt. They are durable. And for a small city car that does not need to drag a giant battery hundreds of highway miles, that trade can make enormous economic sense. And behind that battery sits another advantage that is harder to copy than a cheap wage. China was responsible for nearly 80% of global EV battery cell production in 2024. Its share was even higher in crucial battery materials, roughly 85% of cathode active material, and more than 90% of anode active material. So when a Chinese automaker needs cells, battery materials, power electronics, motors, castings, or charging hardware, it is buying inside the densest electric vehicle supply chain on Earth. Distance becomes cost. Waiting becomes cost. Every supplier markup becomes cost. Every redesign that takes 6 months instead of 6 weeks becomes cost. Legacy automakers spent decades perfecting a different machine. They became brilliant at coordinating huge networks of specialized suppliers around combustion engines, transmissions, and platforms designed to last for many years. That system created world-class cars. But electrification changes which parts matter most. The engine block disappears. The transmission becomes radically simpler. The battery, inverter, software, and electronics move toward the center of the vehicle. Suddenly, expertise accumulated in yesterday's most valuable components does not automatically create an advantage in tomorrow's. And there is another uncomfortable detail. Small cars are hard businesses. A steering wheel does not cost 1/4 as much just because the vehicle is 1/4 cheaper. Airbags, crash structures, computers, seats, glass, wiring, certification, and assembly still have minimum costs. That is why Western automakers have spent years drifting toward larger, more profitable vehicles. China's EV ecosystem is doing the opposite. It is learning to make money, or at least fight for market share, where the selling price is brutally low. If those lessons transfer upward, the threat is no longer a tiny city car. It is the manufacturing discipline learned while building one. This is where one company becomes impossible to ignore. BYD did not begin as a car company. It began in Shenzhen in 1995 making rechargeable batteries. Then, in 2003, it entered the automobile business. Think about the order of those events. Most legacy automakers spent a century mastering cars and then had to learn batteries. BYD mastered batteries and then learned cars. That difference sounds historical. Today, it is financial. BYD makes its own blade batteries. It has deep control over electric drivetrains, power electronics, and an unusually broad range of components. It operates at enormous scale, and by 2025 it sold roughly 4.6 million new energy vehicles globally. By July 2026, the company said it had produced its 17 millionth new energy vehicle. This is not an experimental startup trying to prove Chinese EVs can work. It is an industrial giant learning how many layers of cost it can remove. And then, there is the Chinese market itself. China has dozens of serious EV brands fighting for the same buyers. That competition is brutal. Prices get cut. Features get added. New models arrive faster. A car that looks competitive in January can feel old by December. For manufacturers, that can crush margins. For the industry as a whole, it creates something more dangerous: forced efficiency. If your competitor can add a larger screen, faster charging, or more range without raising the price, you either respond or lose the customer. The winner is not simply the company with the best technology. It is the company that can keep improving while surviving on less money per car. That pressure has already pushed affordable Chinese EVs far beyond golf cart territory. The Wuling Mini EV is genuinely tiny, but Geely's Xingyuan is more revealing. It is more than 4 meters long. It has a 2.65-meter wheelbase. The updated 2026 version offers battery options that reach up to 480 kilometers on China's KLTC test cycle, and its limited-time starting price fell below $10,000. That does not mean an American buyer would get 300 real-world miles for $9,000. Different test cycles produce different numbers. Different markets require different safety equipment. Export pricing adds costs. But even after you strip away the headline, the underlying manufacturing achievement remains uncomfortable. Because now look at what Ford has been doing. Ford spent years pushing hard into EVs, with vehicles like the Mustang Mach-E and F-150 Lightning. The result was not a smooth transition. Its EV business accumulated billions of dollars in losses. In late 2025, Ford announced a major retreat from several EV plans and took a $19.5 billion write-down tied to electric vehicle investments and programs. Reuters reported that Ford had lost about $13 billion on EVs since 2023. The company did not conclude that electric cars were impossible. It concluded that the economics of the EVs it had planned were not good enough. Now Ford is trying something very different. A new low-cost EV platform. A radically simplified manufacturing process. LFP batteries. And a target of roughly $30,000 for a mid-size electric pickup expected in 2027. $30,000 is being treated as a breakthrough price in America. Meanwhile, Chinese consumers are already buying entire electric cars for a third of that. Again, those vehicles are not directly comparable. A small Chinese city hatchback is not an American mid-size pickup. But the comparison reveals where the strategic panic comes from. Western car makers are not terrified that everyone suddenly wants a tiny Wuling. They are terrified that Chinese companies can carry their cost advantages upward, from a $6,000 microcar to a $10,000 hatchback, from a hatchback to a family sedan, from a sedan to an SUV, from cheap transportation to premium transportation. And that movement is already happening. At the 2026 Beijing Auto Show, Chinese brands were not only showing low-cost commuter cars, they were openly targeting categories once dominated by BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Porsche, offering high-performance vehicles with advanced software and luxury features at prices that undercut Western rivals. That is what changes the story. The cheapest Chinese EV is not necessarily the weapon. It is proof that the factory system works. And Western automakers have started responding in ways that would have sounded bizarre a few years ago. Stellantis, owner of brands including Jeep, Peugeot, Fiat, and Opel, bought a stake in Chinese EV maker Leapmotor. By 2026, the relationship had gone much further. The two companies announced plans to build Leapmotor vehicles in Spain. They also planned a new Opel SUV using Leapmotor electric architecture and battery technology, while cooperating on component purchasing. Read that carefully. One of the world's largest Western automotive groups is not simply trying to keep Chinese cars out. It is reaching into China's EV ecosystem to become more competitive itself. Volkswagen has been doing its own version of the same thing through partnerships and development work in China. And in August 2026, Volkswagen's CEO warned that the company needed deep cost reductions, saying overhead costs were more than 30% above competitors as it faced pressure from Chinese rivals, weak profitability, and excess capacity. This is how disruption usually looks before consumers notice it. Not one famous company suddenly collapsing. Internal memos, canceled programs, new partnerships, factory restructuring, job cuts, engineers being told to take 30 parts and turn them into 12. A century-old industrial system slowly realizing that its competitor did not merely invent a cheaper car. It invented a cheaper way of being a car company. There is, however, one enormous wall protecting Western manufacturers: politics. Chinese EVs are largely shut out of the United States by steep tariffs and trade restrictions. The United States raised additional Section 301 duties on Chinese EVs to 100% in 2024. The European Union also imposed additional countervailing duties on Chinese-built battery EVs, including a 17% rate for BYD and higher rates for some other manufacturers. Those measures matter. A $9,000 car does not stay a $9,000 car after tariffs, shipping, homologation, dealer margins, and local requirements. And Chinese manufacturers know this. So they are changing the route. Build locally. BYD has been expanding manufacturing outside China. Leapmotor is working with Stellantis in Europe. Other Chinese companies are exploring or establishing production in overseas markets. Once the factory moves, the tariff stops being the entire answer. And this is where the economics become uncomfortable for Western car makers. They have expensive plants, large workforces, dealer networks, legacy engine programs, pension obligations, complex global supplier structures, decades of product assumptions built around vehicles that generate enough gross profit to support all of it. A cheap EV attacks the car price. A cheap manufacturing system attacks everything underneath the car price. That does not mean Ford, GM, Volkswagen, Stellantis, or Toyota disappear. They have brands people trust, enormous distribution networks, engineering expertise, financing operations, and factories that Chinese newcomers would spend decades trying to reproduce. And the Chinese industry has problems of its own. Its domestic price war has damaged profitability. Some manufacturers will not survive. Overcapacity is real. Trade barriers are rising. And low Chinese domestic prices cannot simply be copied into every foreign market. But something fundamental has already changed. For decades, the affordable car was the bottom rung of the automotive ladder. Now it may become the place where the next manufacturing system proves itself. Go back to that American dealership. The $51,456 average new car no longer looks expensive only because of inflation, features, or consumer taste. Now there is another number sitting beside it. $9,100. Not an equivalent car. Not an American price. Not a promise that your next vehicle will cost less than 10 grand. A warning. Because if one industrial ecosystem can build functional EVs for that little, every automaker selling cars for 3, 4, or 5 times more eventually has to answer a brutal question. Which part of that difference is value? And which part is cost structure? China's sub-$10,000 EVs do not have to flood American dealerships to disrupt Western car makers. They only have to prove that the old economics are no longer inevitable. If you like documentaries that uncover the hidden economics behind ordinary products and the factories rewriting entire industries, subscribe. And tell me this. If a Chinese-built EV met local safety standards, offered the range you actually needed, and cost $15,000 instead of $40,000, would the badge on the hood still matter?